Hello dear friends, I am Dr. Parveen Malik and welcome back to PM Knowledge Hub. So in previous lectures, we had discussed the concept of hypothesis, characteristics of a good hypothesis and sources or basis for the formulation of hypothesis. Today I will talk about types of hypothesis. So without wasting any more time, let's get started. It is very difficult to give a classification of hypothesis that can be universally accepted as different scholars have classified it in different ways. On the basis of various classifications, the type of hypothesis can be classified as declarative hypothesis, hypothesis in question form, and null hypothesis. The declarative hypothesis is further divided into two types, directional hypothesis and non-directional hypothesis. Now let's understand about the first type of hypothesis, and that is declarative hypothesis. If a researcher formulates a hypothesis keeping in mind the expected result, then it is called a declarative hypothesis. It is also known as an alternative or research hypothesis. The researcher expects some result based on his or her experience in the field or on the basis of review or study of the literature. He converts such expectations into hypothesis. It means he makes some announcement about the result of the research. Hence, such a hypothesis is called declarative hypothesis. Declarative hypotheses are denoted by H1, H2. Some of the special features of declarative hypothesis are: the researcher formulates declarative hypotheses based on past experience, study of research material, or findings of previous research. Such a hypothesis is formulated on the basis of expected findings of the research. Such a hypothesis is accepted when the null hypothesis is not accepted. Such a hypothesis is influenced by the beliefs of the researcher, so it cannot always be fair. There are two types of declarative hypothesis. The first one is the directional hypothesis and the second one is non-directional hypothesis. Now let's start to understand the directional hypothesis. This hypothesis reflects the expected direction of the outcome. This means that such a hypothesis assumes a particular outcome in favor of a factor or variable. In other words, it can be said that the directional hypothesis expects a particular outcome out of the possible outcomes in favor of a certain variable. Directional hypothesis clearly indicates the difference or relationship between the variable characteristics under study in terms of the independent variable. Let's try to understand these types with the help of an example. Study of the teaching ability of student teachers in relation to their gender. Directional hypothesis can be formulated with reference to this title, like the teaching ability of male student teacher is better than that of female student teachers, or the teaching ability of female student teachers is better than that of male student teachers. In both the hypotheses, the teaching ability of one is expected to be better than that of the other. Thus, both the hypotheses show some result of research in favor of the fixed variable. Here, teaching ability is a variable trait under the study and gender is an independent variable. Let's have a look at one more example. With reference to the title, Study of the Relationship Between Mental Health and Adjustment Level of Male Teachers of Secondary School. Now for this research study, the directional hypothesis can be made like: there is a positive relationship between mental health and adjustment level of the male teachers of secondary schools, or male teachers of secondary schools with higher mental health have higher adjustment levels. Here, both hypotheses show a positive relationship between mental health and adjustment level of male teachers. This means both indicates a certain direction of research. The hypothesis for the same title can also be written as: there is a negative correlation between mental health level and adjustment level of male teachers of secondary schools, or male secondary school teachers with low mental health levels have low adjustment levels. These hypotheses make it clear that directional hypothesis expects a certain kind of relationship between two or more variables. If the researcher cannot remain unbiased with the process of research, such hypothesis may lead him to formulate hypotheses based on his own beliefs instead of taking pre-experiences and taking into account the primary evidence available. Such work can bring subjectivity to the formulation of hypothesis, whereby the researcher will collect only data that can support his belief. The second type of declarative hypothesis is the non-directional hypothesis, a hypothesis that does not indicate the direction of the outcome or does not expect an outcome in favor of some variable is called a non-directional hypothesis. More clearly, it can be said that it considers differences but does not favor any variable in terms of dependent variable. In interrelational studies, it considers the relationship between variables but does not specify the type of relationship such as positive or negative. Suppose a research is to be conducted on to study the teaching ability of higher secondary school teachers with reference to their gender. The non-directional hypothesis would be as there is a difference in teaching ability of male and female teachers of higher secondary schools. This hypothesis considers a difference between the teaching ability of male and female teachers but does not favor any of them. This means it does not expect results in any one direction. According to this hypothesis, the conclusion of the research can be in favor of male or female. Let us take another example of these type of hypothesis in terms of the relationship between two variables. Suppose a research is to be conducted on to study the relationship between emotional maturity and adjustment level of secondary school teachers. Then the non-directional hypothesis would be as there is a correlation between emotional maturity and adjustment level of secondary school teachers. This hypothesis expects a relationship between two variables but does not assume a relationship such as positive or negative. The second type of hypothesis is hypothesis in question form. In this type of hypothesis, a question is formed rather than a definite outcome being expected. For example, a study of the stress level of higher secondary school students in the context of their stream. The hypothesis in the question form would be, is there a difference in exam related stress of arts, commerce and science students of higher secondary schools? Do arts students in higher secondary schools have more exam related stress than science students? Are commerce students in higher secondary schools more concerned about exams than science students? Are commerce students of higher secondary schools more concerned about exams than arts students? Let us take another example to understand these type of hypotheses in terms of the relationship between two variables. If the study is to be conducted to study the relationship between intelligence and work stress of government employees, then the research hypothesis of the question type would be as, do government employees with higher intelligence levels have less work stress? Do government employees have a low level of intelligence? Do they have more work stress? Is there a positive relationship between intelligence and work stress of government employees? Is there a negative relationship between intelligence and work stress of government employees? Is there any relationship between intelligence and work stress of government employees? Referring to these hypotheses, it is quite clear that the question type hypothesis can be directional or non-directional hypothesis. The third type of hypothesis is null hypothesis. If in the case of a dependent variable, the hypothesis indicates no difference between two or more layers of independent variables, it is called a null hypothesis. The null hypothesis indicates no relationship between two variables if there is a correlational study. The null hypothesis is denoted by the H0 symbol. Such a hypothesis is also called a no difference type hypothesis or a no relationship type hypothesis. Let's try to understand these type of hypothesis with the help of an example. The study of the effectiveness of laboratory teaching program on the achievement of the students of standard 8 in mathematics. The null hypothesis would be as, please remember, it is denoted by H0, not HO. So H0 is, there is no significant difference between the achievement of the students in mathematics who have learned through laboratory teaching program and traditional method, or there is no significant effect of the laboratory teaching program on the achievement of the students of grade 8 in mathematics. There is no significant effect of the laboratory teaching program program on the mean achievement scores of the students of grade 8 in mathematics. There is no significant difference between the mean achievement scores of the students of grade 8 in mathematics who have learned through laboratory teaching program and traditional method. Please note, in this example, laboratory teaching program is mentioned in the title of the study, but two methods are mentioned in the hypothesis. If the methods are not mentioned in the title of the study, then they can be mentioned in this way in the hypothesis. Researcher may indicate the instructional method in the title of the study, but while doing so, the title will be lengthened. Let's take another example to understand null hypothesis in the context of relationship between two variables. If a researcher wants to carry out research on a study of the relationship between the IQ and mathematical reasoning ability of the students of secondary schools, the null hypothesis will be as there is no significant relationship between IQ and mathematical reasoning ability of the students of secondary schools. There is no significant correlation between the scores of the students of secondary schools in the IQ test and mathematical reasoning ability test. We have discussed different ways of writing null hypothesis. Null hypothesis can be classified in two different ways on the basis of description of measurement in the hypothesis. There are two types of hypothesis on the basis of description of the measurement, and they are classical hypothesis and operational hypothesis. Let's try to understand classical hypothesis first. If the measurement is not mentioned in the null hypothesis, it is called classical null hypothesis. For example, there is no significant difference between the achievement of the students of grade 8 in mathematics who have learned through laboratory teaching program and traditional method. There is no significant relationship between IQ and mathematical reasoning ability of the students of secondary schools of Ahmedabad district. There are no indications of measurement in either hypothesis. The second type of hypothesis is operational null hypothesis. When the measurement of variable characteristics is indicated in the null hypothesis, then it is called the operational null hypothesis. For example, there is no significant difference between the mean score of the students of grade 8 in achievement test in mathematics who have learned through laboratory teaching program and traditional method. There is no significant correlation between the scores of the students of secondary schools of Ahmedabad districts in mathematical reasoning ability test and IQ test. In the first hypothesis, scores of the students in the achievement test are mentioned to test the hypothesis. The mean score of the achievement of both the groups have to be calculated. This hypothesis has a measures of average which is called mean score in this hypothesis. In the second hypothesis, correlation between the scores of the students in the mathematical reasoning ability test and IQ test is mentioned. Therefore, the coefficient of correlation must be calculated to test the hypothesis. Thus, the term correlation indicates the measure in the hypothesis. The operational null hypothesis can be made more precise by indicating the name of the specific tool of research. There is no significant difference in the mean scores of teachers of government and self-financed secondary schools of Ahmedabad district in the mental health battery developed by Manoj Shastri. There is no significant correlation between the scores of the students of secondary schools of Ahmedabad district in the 16 PFQ test developed by Ramesh Patel and the emotional maturity scale developed by Manoj Shastri. So this is all about the types of hypothesis. Thank you so much for watching my video.